Welcome to Brookline Booksmith Author Event Series. My name is Alex. I'm the events director here at the store, and today it's a privilege to both introduce and interview tonight's author. Alexander Monea is an assistant professor serving jointly in the English Department and Cultural Studies program at George Mason University, whose research focuses on the historical and cultural impact of computation and fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics. He's the author of The Digital Closet, How the Internet Became Straight from MIT Press, and co-author of a forthcoming book, The Prison House of the Circuit, A New Politics of Control, coming from University of Minnesota Press. In this book, The Digital Closet, Alex argues the algorithmic and ideological pushing of LGBTQIA+ people and their content out of sight on the internet, walking back a brief period of access and community granted by the early web. So Alex, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
So this is a big topic and it's a critical topic. How did it become a passion project for you?
Yeah, it's a really weird story, actually. So this book kind of found me. I didn't really set out to write this book, or didn't know in advance that I was going to write this book. When I finished grad school, I was working on natural language processing algorithms. And I got invited to do a conference panel with a bunch of people that were more in visual studies. And so I thought that computer vision algorithms were sort of mechanically similar enough to natural language processing algorithms that I could look into them and, have some insight. And so, I'm racking my brain trying to figure out what I want to do for this panel on computer vision. And most of the computer vision algorithms that I could think of were really bad. Right?
Yeah.
Like they're comically, misidentifying school buses as pumpkins and things like that. And the one area that I could think of that they were operating rather effectively was in eliminating nudity in search results,
Yeah.
right? Because I remember when I was younger, almost anything that you typed into Google image search would lead to nudity. Whereas sometime in the past decade, things radically shifted, and I just never stumbled across pornography anymore. Or very rarely did. And so I decided that that might be an interesting place to look at computer vision algorithms to get a sense of, how they were working and what they were structured like. And so as I did that, I started looking into the data sets that they were trained on and some of their operations, and I just found heteronormative bias after heteronormative bias. And those examples started to aggregate, right? And so I did a conference paper on it that worked really well, and I was encouraged to try to turn it into an article. So I submitted it as an article, and every time I would get feedback on it, the piece would just grow and grow and grow, right? Because people had all these questions about different areas of it, and eventually I had this 40,000 word paper that didn't fit anywhere, and luckily at that time I met folks at MIT, and then it became a much bigger book project, right? So it was sort of something that I stumbled into backwards, and it just got really sort of obsessed with, and it just grew and grew and grew until it was a book.
Amazing. Well, you're talking about that sort of 10-year shift, and the title of the book is How the Internet Became Straight, and I think the became in that really indicates a sea change. So what is the before and what is the after of this change, and is there a marked moment that sort of shut that door for people?
Yeah. So I think the before and after for me really has to do with a certain political economy that emerged online, and a certain sort of web architecture. And the political economy is that of advertising monetization, and the architecture is that of platforms, right? So when the web was more decentralized and more heterogeneous and less advertising driven, I mean, you can tell me what you think, but what I remember from being younger and being online was just a lot of heterogeneity, right? You would type inquiries into Google search, and you would wind up on people's personal pages.
Oh yeah, Angel Fire, forever.
Yeah, and GeoCities and things like that. And it was a lot more voices when you were searching around online. And that's not to say that there weren't still problems with the way internet content was structured, or the internet was governed, or things like that. But there wasn't as much centralization of control over content decisions as there is now. And so, I mean, there's not a point at which you could like pinpoint the disjuncture. It occurs over a period of 10, 15 years as platforms centralize their power, increase their ability to moderate content, develop community standards to appease advertisers, and especially as people are gatekept into those communities on mobile, people just end up experiencing the internet through the lens of these platforms, right? For so many people now, the internet is Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. It's not like URLs that you're randomly jumping to.
Yeah, and that's so interesting because I was talking to a developer friend about this recently, which is that a lot of that internet that you're talking about, this more diverse and individual and splintered internet, a lot of that still exists. Like, we could, at this moment, leave this room and go make ourselves an Angel Fire page. And if somebody wanted to visit it, they could. They might have a hard time finding it, but it would exist.
Yeah.
But you talk a lot in the book about essentially these central, huge platforms not really being opt-outable. To a certain degree, they're a requirement for navigating social spaces in the year 2021, 22. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple things there. First, while you could make something and put it online, it only really exists if people are discovering it, right? So, like, researchers did a really interesting experiment with Spotify where they found that the vast majority of people only navigate not just like library databases, but like internet search. You see all the time, there's wide discrepancies in it. And there's a ton of young people that are not nearly as tech savvy as they are presumed to be by sort of
like handful, count on your fingers, major websites that do algorithmically control what of their content you ever see, and which are designed not only to be foolproof for the user, but also like directly control the user to a really high degree.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what you're saying about Google and its searchability is that its high quality granular search features still exist, but it's literally hard to find them on google.com.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, every time I show students like the Boolean strings that you can plug into a Google search bar that change the results, it like blows their mind. They think all you can type into it is a question.
Yeah, well, and I remember when putting a question into a search engine was like, will this work? I think not. Asking Jeeves, but we're not sure.
Right, yeah.
That's some of the tech that's going on. Can you talk a little bit about the actual technological things that are happening that are erasing queerness and other marginalizations from people's results, from people's platforms, from what people are seeing? What's actually being done that's causing this?
Yeah, I mean, so the first part is where the motivation to do it comes from, right? And in the first place, it was largely driven by advertisers. There's a deep assumption that's hard to, get direct quotes from, because I can't get into these meetings with ad execs, but everyone that I can read or hear from in Silicon Valley talks about how advertisers do not want their ads to show up anywhere near pornographic search results. And no one wants a pornographic ad to show up near their organic search results. So there's already this sort of strong paranoia over porn sort of invading content platforms. So that's one motivation for it. And then the other is legislation, right? So the passage of the FOSTA-SESTA Act in 2017 really ramped this up by changing what ISPs and content hosts could be held accountable for. And the act conflates pornography with sex trafficking. And so it creates this broad spectrum of activities, all of which could be considered illegal and could leave companies liable to the U.S., which
Right.
really, instituted a panic in Silicon Valley. So there's sort of these dual motivations of like never letting porn on your platform because it's bad for advertisers, and never letting porn on your platform because the U.S. government might hold you accountable for it. And that drives lots of research and development in terms of how to filter porn. You have sophisticated computer vision algorithms that try to detect nude bodies. They have biased data sets that they're trained on. They have, for instance, part of the data set includes what they presume to be closeted gay men, and they're trained to identify those.
Yeah, that moment in the book is really startling and distressing, I
Yeah.
would say, when you have a computer program that is trained to identify a marginalized group.
Yeah.
That sort of gives a sense of foreboding when you discover that that's something.
Yeah, it's very creepy.
Yeah,
and they're also trained to be able to identify what they term sluts, which is exclusively women and or trans women, based on their data set. It's hard to find representation of any other group in the like thousands of images that they have populated in that category. So like the algorithms themselves have biased training data. Then once they're trained, their sensitivity is cranked way up, right? Because the assumption is that it's better for a lot of LGBTQIA+ content to get banned accidentally, then it's better for that to happen than for even one child to ever see one piece of pornography, right? And that sort of rhetorical cudgel is used over and over again to justify this. So you've got algorithms with sort of faulty training parameters, and then their sensitivity is cranked way up to the top, so they have a lot of false positives. And that gets coupled with human content review, which has similar biases embedded in the corporate policies that people are trained on, and it's operated for pennies on the dollar at rapid speed with undertrained workers. And so from both ends of the spectrum, from like the human review to the fully automated algorithmic review, you have lots of sort of embedded biases and problems.
Well, one thing you say, in addition to the actual biases in place, you can't speak to the exact mores of every single person who is vetting material, but also you note that many people are doing this out of context and with like a second to decide if something is okay or not. And for both of those reasons, both the moral standpoint and the lack of context reasons, there are plenty of reasons that things just get miscategorized. But I mean, this brings up sort of a difficult question, which is one of the driving factors behind all of this, as you're saying, is protect people from sexual imagery and content who do not want to see it, or who adults do not want their children to see it.
Yeah.
And that on its own doesn't sound objectionable, but also, part and parcel of that is that you're demonizing any kind of sexual content, and that isn't necessarily something you want to ally with. So, how do you sort of balance when you're making arguments, saying like, first of all, not all of this content is sexual, and that's a problem. Second of all, some of this content is sexual, and that's also a problem. Is that something that you get blowback on, and how do you address it?
Well, I mean, I think that issue is one of a few that like really touches a nerve in like American culture in particular. And so I think it's one that like we really need to start by having a more robust conversation about, and also doing more research about. It's really hard to get research funded on people under the age of 18's experience with pornography, whether it's accidentally stumbling upon it, or intentionally seeking it out, what they use it for, what the impacts are. There's many fewer studies on that than you would expect for us to be able to just make a blanket claim that
Right.
it's wrong or that it's problematic. And so I think from the start, we need to have a more robust conversation about that, and also, collect more data on it, because we're really acting ideologically or instinctively about it, and I think that's a real hindrance to making an informed decision about, which side of the equation to focus on, or how to balance the equation, right? To my mind, from a lot of the stuff that I was reading, tamping down the sensitivity of these algorithms can alleviate a lot of the false positives, and without sort of letting that much pornography through. And the issue is that, if children want to find, and again, children's a loaded term, right? Because like, it's one thing for us to think about an adolescent that's like 16 searching for porn online. Most people would consider that rather normal behavior, even if they were, trying to prevent it.
Right.
It's very different when you're thinking about like a 5-year-old, right? So like differentiating between those is a good starting point. But anyone in that age group, if they want to find pornography, can get around those filters rather easily, right? And so really, the benefit that you're getting from overbroad filters, I just don't know how much it's worth.
Right. Well, it seems like what happens is that the big sign being held up is protect children.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't seem totally clear that any of these policies or moves do that.
Yeah.
And it does have a really notable effect. I'm not going to say side effect, I'm going to say effect of silencing and erasing and demonetizing and demonizing groups of people who are already in vulnerable positions.
Yeah, I mean, you said it maybe better than I could. I 100% agree with that.
Well, I just read the book, so.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what's happening. And anytime, I mean, the two sort of signals that you can see in contemporary discourse where people are going to start manipulating audiences are when they start talking about children's unwanted exposure. That's always a sort of tool that you can use to force people to vote with you or force people to agree with you, because you just can't be seen on a public stage arguing for children's exposure to pornography.
No, and why would you?
Well, so that's the first sort of tool, right? And then the other is the sort of conflation of all sex work with sex trafficking, right? And so these two rhetorical hammers of sort of sex trafficking and child sex abuse are deployed across the board to sort of invalidate any counter arguments, and also to evacuate any sort of gray area that you might find for common ground between the positions. It's just all censorship, or you're sort of demonized.
So I think the question that this raises, since what we're saying is these methods don't necessarily do the thing that they're intended, but they do this other thing, which many would be considered to be very harmful. Do you think that the policies are actually mostly intended for their stated purpose, or are these side effects actually one of the goals?
It's hard to say, right? So, I mean, Lisa Nakamura wrote in 2013 about sort of racism being proliferant online. That is, at a certain point, you have to stop thinking of it as a bug and start thinking of it as a feature, right? And I definitely think that this is systemic enough that it does seem to be like almost like an actively cultivated feature by certain audiences. It's hard to say for certain, right? Because so much of it is mirroring our own cultural biases that are embedded in data, and then being sort of reified by coders that are either supportive of those biases or unaware of them, or just don't think they're important. And then it sort of comes back full circle and impacts the real world again. So, I mean, I guess the question of whether it's intentional or not to me is less interesting, right? Because I don't really think that looking for the evil genius that's like planning the demise of like queer communities is like the appropriate way to go about it, because even if you were to eliminate that person, I don't think this would stop. It's too structural. It requires fixes at so many different levels that I think it's a it's a scarier answer than that it's intentional. It's that it's structural and unavoidable without like serious mobilization and change.
Well, I think something that's interesting about the way that you approach this topic is that you talk about different forces at play that result in the digital closet of the title. And I think there can be a tendency in everyday life to sort of partition out each of those forces and minimize their scariness, I would say.
Yeah.
Like you can have mean people on the internet. They're just mean people, they're just on the internet. Or you can have a politician who's like, oh, that guy is a fringe guy and what he says isn't that important, he's just one guy.
Yeah.
Or you can have a private corporation and say like, oh, but they're a company, like it's not as if the government. But when all of those things are in place simultaneously, the overall effect is pretty significant. And also I would say possibly not something that you can partition out, because some of those people fall into more than one of those categories. So there's...
Oh, I totally agree. I think that, I mean, from what statistics or polls you can find, it does seem to be like there is a broad sort of cultural backlash against LGBTQIA plus advancement, and a sort of slippage since the 2016 election. The number of people that report as allies have fallen precipitously. The passage of bills has ramped up, like the Don't Say Gay bill that's going on in Florida right now. There's definitely a concerted effort to combat queer advancement from people in politics, in business, on the ground, and online. So I don't think that's imagined at all. I think maybe the thing that we could find some hope in is that there is a large number of people that are their targets who could also band together, and I think this book is just one part of that story, right? Like, queer people aren't the only people being abused online or systemically mistreated by algorithms, right? You could look at Sophia Noble or Rua Benjamin's work and easily see how there's a natural alliance here with people of color. You could look at Virginia Eubanks' work and think about a natural alliance with people of low socioeconomic class. So there's a broad set of people that are being targeted as well, and there's alliances to be made in contrast to this sort of aggregate of, I don't know, homophobic, transphobic sort of activists that are, trying to push progress back.
I want to circle back slightly to what you said about class. I actually was interested in the point you brought up about one of the non-content ways in which Google prioritizes results. And you were saying, like, the fancier, more expensive, better supported websites tend to float to the top.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting, because to me, that feeds into your point, where there are business reasons to be doing this, there are quality reasons to be doing this, but the fallout of that is often class-based. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's a marked difference in Google's operations. They have somewhere over 250 quality content signifiers that are mostly secret, but you can sort of look at search engine optimizers and other people that work in that domain to sort of reverse engineer some of them. And a lot of them have to do with having like perfectly up-to-date CSS, JavaScript, HTML that's organized in just the right way, images of just the right quality, updates of just the right size. So there's a lot of sort of quality metrics that you're only going to have if you are like continually keeping your website up to the absolute best standards, and that's on top of the already existing like in-link topology that Google was founded on, right? So not only do you have to like have very fancy sites linking to your site, but you also have to have your site like constantly updated,
Right.
constantly with the like most pristine code if you want to appear near the top of the search
That
results.
is fascinating. Not really something that I realized. Um, this is a totally different topic, but I thought it was really interesting. You sort of begin the book um, with the root of the problem, talking about the sort of puritanical hatred of sexuality of any kind. And I would love you to just give a moment to that history and the way that it ties into our current moment and this problem.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the beginning of the book is a weird point because I felt like I needed to define heterosexuality so that I could have a clear sense of what heteronormativity was for readers, right? Like, what is this thing that's getting reified all over the place or normalized all over the place? And when I tried to write it down, it's really hard to define heterosexuality, right? Because it's a really idiosyncratic term. And so I started digging, trying to find its roots, right? And in U.S. culture, it's obviously based in puritanical origins around procreation, right? So in the 1600s and 1700s, the sexual sort of ethos was based all around procreative sex, and even sex for pleasure with your spouse was considered taboo.
That's just, come on, guys.
Yeah.
Just like
And
a slight loosening up of the Puritans could really have changed things for a lot of us quite a bit.
well, the way that the people escape the sort of Puritan ethos is weird too, right? Because you originally have heterosexuality defined as a like psychiatric problem in Europe, right? It was men who wanted to have sex with women too much, right? More than the procreative purpose. And through sort of psychoanalysis and romanticism, these sort of twin movements, you have this agreement reached where if you are in love, you can have sex, and sex, it becomes a biological need, mostly of like middle class white men, right? They have biological desires that cannot be contained, and so you sort of reach this this impasse where, on the one hand, sex is biologically necessitated, and its only proper outlet is someone that you're courting and that you're in love with and intend to marry. That's sort of the agreement with the Protestant ethic. And on the other hand, it still has this undercurrent of procreativeness. And you see both of these rear their ugly heads in a lot of alt-right discourse as well. They're both still, I think, active in structuring heterosexuality today. And that's just one of the unstable binaries that sort of plays a huge role in heterosexuality. The difference between biologically driven need to have straight sex versus like theologically ordained procreative sex maritally.
Yeah, they're both pretty ideologically constricting. Even if they don't always agree with each other, I think they can both be equally like limiting in not only what you're allowed to do, but what you're allowed to think or feel about other people.
Yeah, for sure.
So thank you. It always comes down to Puritanism in this country. It's like, what's that about? It was the Puritans. They came here and they did that.
Yeah.
I have so many other questions. One thing that I wanted to talk about a bit is that I think we have this tendency, even still, when online life is so much a part of everyday life, when we're constantly with phones. I think there's still sort of this belief that the online and the material planes are not the same, and one is more real than the other because you might physically share space with something or someone. So I want to speak against that a bit and ask about some of the material effects of some of the erasure that we see through algorithm or ideology.
Yeah, so I think that's something I try to keep centered in the book, right? The sort of ways that this has material impacts on people's everyday lives. And there's a ton of them, right? So there's a ton of them if you think of queer youth, right? Who might not have access to community resources or queer community resources if they grow up in a rural area or somewhere or with a family that's unaccepting. If they grow up in that same area, they might not have a safe place to explore their sexuality initially and try to figure out sort of what they're interested in and sort of who they are. It's always more dangerous to explore that with other people in an area that's unaccepting, right? And so sort of by cutting this stuff offline, it pushes it back into the real world, and there's a reason people, queer people in particular, try to escape the real world at certain places and certain times, right? And it has to do with being closeted, being stuck in certain areas, having unaccepting family members, things like that. And so I think there's a huge impact there. The other one that's really easy to see is with sex workers, right? So after Fosta Sesta shuttered back pages where sex workers would post advertisements and shuttered their sort of community resources where they would rate and review clients, so many sex workers were pushed back into the streets to secure anonymous clients. And also because they're denied financial services, they have to operate an all-cash business, which means you can be robbed, you can be raped, you can be killed, and you have very little recourse for most of it. And so you saw a wave of violence against sex workers after Fosta Sesta, and this sort of plays out intersectionally, where sort of the more marginalized you are, or the more marginalized identity categories you hold, the more precarious your position is, right? So like when you would read reports, it was like trans disabled black women that were just like really going through the shit after Fosta Sesta. And so, you know, the material impacts abound by pushing stuff offline or denying resources to people online.
And I think speaking to the queer youth in particular, I think it's easy for some groups of Americans at the moment to sort of understand and understate the risk that queer youth still face in this country. And one thing is, of course, the growing pushback that you were talking about. But the other is just the statistics of what it is to be queer in a youth. Like the volume at which runaways and unhoused youth are queer people who do not have support from their families and have no other places to go is just astronomical. And so you can see on that material level how vital it is that there be places for them to go safely. So I think that's a very legitimate point to bring up. But so Fosta Sesta is what we've talked about the most. It's obviously not the beginning of that fight, and it's certainly not the end of that fight. I think for a lot of people, it passed, the uproar died down, the material effects happened to all of us, but especially sex workers, and that isn't the end of it. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Earn It Act.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically Lindsey Graham's proposal to amplify Fosta Sesta to a new degree, which, I mean, a lot of the material harms that we were just talking about would just be amplified even more. Platforms would be even more scared to host objectionable content. It would give alt-right trolls even more tools to deplatform people that they didn't agree with. And I mean, I don't know that Earn It could pass, right? That Lindsey Graham could get a bill through in this day. But there's lots of people that agree with it, and there's people that agree with it on both sides of the aisle.
Well, that's one of the things about Fosta Sesta, isn't it? That it didn't just pass in the Senate; it really passed in the Senate.
With flying colors.
Yes,
it was
with
terrible.
very little resistance.
Yeah, I mean, the number of states, I think it's 15, 16 states now, a number of which unanimously passed bills claiming that pornography was a public health crisis. There's tons of support in both the Congress and the Senate, or both the House of Representatives and the Senate. I don't think that we should be surprised if more of these bills pop up and if some of them pass. And I think some of the infrastructure needs to be laid for organizing and activism now, rather than waiting till it's even worse than it is now to get started.
So, I think sort of the rounding out question for all of this is this is not always an easy book to read because of all of the things that we've been discussing. There are a lot of problems, and the problem is pretty monumental. So, a little bit of anxiety in writing and reading, I think. But you are talking about organizing, and I wonder if you see any recourse for marginalized people at this point, and do you think, limiting it to the internet, do you think the internet is broken in a way that it cannot be fixed or subverted?
So I don't think the internet can be fixed without like revolutionary level changes, right? I think that, so in the end of the book, I sort of outline what I think of as some provisional mechanisms that we could use to make, forgetting the word off the top of my head, oh my god. It's
Happens to me every day of my life. More than once.
Revisionist. Oh my God.
Yeah. Yay!
All right, so I break up some of the responses into revisionist versus revolutionary. Right, revisionist solutions are things to me that seem like plugging holes in a sinking ship. It's not going to fix the internet, but it might make things a little bit better or get us by for a little while. And those are things like trying to get companies to commit to an anti-censorship pact, sort of building community resources to keep track of who's getting their content censored, when and where and why, so that we can produce better reporting on what's going on, and sort of pushing for Title IX investigations and other things like that to try to activate pre-existing regulatory bodies to sort of help out the queer community here. I think that there are a number of more revolutionary strategies that would be needed to make the internet better. And I think they involve things like not just, I mean, I think bigger than breaking up Facebook, right? Like breaking up the monopoly. I think it should be a public utility, right? I don't think a handful of billionaires should get to decide what content gets posted online or what their content policies
That's a problem.
Yeah. Victor Picard just posted an article, I think, in The Nation today on this, on how a few billionaires just can't be making these decisions, right? And so I think making social media companies into public utilities, I think connecting up with other movements and seeing how things like defunding the police is just as essential to sort of limiting the material impacts of the digital closet as it is for Black Lives Matter, is an essential step. I really think it's going to take revolutionary actions like that, like abolishing police, turning internet companies into public utilities, like revolutionary grassroots actions if you want the internet to live up to its potential.
Thank you. And thank you so much for talking through all of this with me. This is a fascinating book to read. I really swallowed it in basically one sitting. So I went through 2 packets of Post-its, and I am so glad that I got to read it and also discuss it with you. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me, Alex. Yeah. My most prepared interviewer of all time.